The little black girl screamed to the biker that a stranger marked trees along her path leading to the hill. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. It was a warm, late afternoon at the Riverton Harvest Carnival. The sweet smell of kettle corn mixed with the scent of motor oil as the sounds of laughter and carnival games filled the air. But amid all the light-hearted chatter, a piercing scream cut through the noise. A little black girl, no more than 10 years old, came running, her face streaked with tears, her chest heaving as she screamed for help. Her small hands clutched at the nearest person she could find, a group of bikers manning a booth near the rides. "Please help me." A stranger marked the trees along the path to the hill. She cried, her voice shaking with fear. The bikers were taken aback. They had been having a quiet moment, enjoying their break from the busy carnival. But something about the girl's desperation stopped them cold. The leader of the group, a grizzled biker named Jack, stepped forward. His eyes, usually tough and battle-hardened, softened at the sight of the girl's terror. "What's going on, kid? What do you mean by marked trees?" he asked, kneeling down to her level. The little girl, her voice trembling, explained that as she was walking with her brother, they noticed strange marks on the trees along the narrow path leading up to the hill behind the carnival grounds. The marks were distinct, symbols that didn't belong in the forest. She said a man had been watching them from the distance. As they got closer to the hill, the man's presence became more threatening. "I don't know who he was," she stammered, "but I saw him watching me. I ran, but my brother didn't make it." Jack's eyes narrowed as he processed her words. He turned to his crew, the other bikers, who were now all listening intently. The group was used to dealing with danger, but this felt different. This wasn't just some random trouble. The girl was terrified, and her brother was still out there. "All right, listen up," Jack said firmly. "We're going to find out what's going on. Stay calm, stay sharp." The bikers gathered quickly, assessing the situation. A couple of them immediately hopped on their bikes and rode off in the direction the girl had pointed, scouting ahead. Jack stayed behind with the others, speaking softly to the girl. "Don't worry. We'll find your brother, and we won't let anyone hurt you," he reassured her. As the last of the bikes roared to life, the group set off together, their engines rumbling like thunder in the distance. The night was drawing closer, and the path ahead was growing darker by the minute. The girl's fear was palpable, but she held on to the hope that these bikers, strangers, yet now her protectors, would keep their promise. She looked up at Jack, her wide eyes filled with desperation but also a glimmer of trust. The hill loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, its shape almost like a shadow watching over them. As the bikers sped toward the path, a sense of unease settled over the group. There was something about this hill, about the marks on those trees, that didn't sit right. This wasn't just a chance encounter. They were heading into something much bigger and much more dangerous. The sound of their bikes echoed into the night, growing louder as they neared the hill, ready for whatever awaited them. The group of bikers rode in formation, their engines roaring as they cut through the dusk. The path leading to the hill grew steeper, the trees growing denser, and the air became thick with the smell of pine and earth. The girl, still clutching onto Jack's leather vest, looked back at the growing line of bikers behind them. Her heart pounded, her small hands shaking, but the comfort of knowing she wasn't alone in this made her feel just a little safer. Jack, riding in front, kept his eyes on the trail ahead, trying to push past the gnawing feeling in his gut. Something wasn't right. He had dealt with his share of bad situations, but this felt different. The girl had spoken of marks on the trees, a strange man lurking in the shadows, and her brother's disappearance. But none of that explained the unsettling sense of danger Jack felt growing with every mile they traveled. He could see the outline of the hill now, looming dark and silent in the distance. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being led into a trap. As the group approached the foot of the hill, Jack gave the signal, and the bikers slowed down. They stopped in a small clearing, just out of sight from the path, their engines cutting off one by one. The sound of the bikes echoed through the trees for a moment, but then silence fell. Only the rustle of the wind and the occasional distant bird call filled the void. Jack turned to the girl, his voice soft but firm. "We'll figure this out, all right? Stay close." She nodded, her face pale but determined. Jack glanced at the other bikers, a group of hardened men who had seen their share of trouble. Each one of them was scanning the surroundings, eyes sharp, looking for anything that seemed out of place. "Bear, you and Diesel take the east side," Jack said, his voice low. "Vince, you go with me and watch the west. Everyone else, spread out, but keep your eyes open. We don't know what we're walking into." The bikers acknowledged him with a nod, their movements precise as they broke into smaller groups, each one keeping close to their assigned position. Jack could see the tension in the girl's eyes as she clung to his side, but she didn't say a word. She had already said all she needed to. Jack could see her fear, but he also saw something else, hope. She trusted them, and that trust weighed heavily on his shoulders. The group moved forward, splitting off as planned. Jack kept his focus on the narrow trail leading up the hill, trying to make sense of the markings on the trees. There was something about them that felt too deliberate, too planned. It wasn't just random graffiti or a trail left by someone who had wandered off the beaten path. These marks seemed intentional, like a message, one that only the person who had made them understood. The deeper they went, the more Jack's instincts screamed that they were heading into something far more dangerous than just a missing kid. The air grew colder, the wind picking up as they climbed the hill. The trees were thick around them, casting deep shadows that seemed to move with every step they took. And then, as they rounded a bend in the trail, they saw it. The clearing at the top of the hill was vast, open, and completely still. But there, standing just at the edge of the clearing, was the man. He was tall, wearing a long coat that blended into the darkness of the trees, his face obscured by a hood. And standing beside him, motionless, was the girl's brother. The sight of him was enough to freeze Jack in place for a second. The boy was pale, his clothes dirty, but he was alive. And for a moment, Jack thought they had won. But the look in the man's eyes told him otherwise. There was a coldness there, a sense of control that Jack hadn't expected. The man wasn't just holding the boy, he was waiting for them. Jack's heart raced, his mind calculating their options. It was clear that the man wasn't alone. There had to be more of them hidden in the trees. They had walked into a trap. Jack took a slow breath, his voice steady as he addressed the man. "Let the boy go," he said, his tone calm but firm. "This doesn't have to get ugly." The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the bikers, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You think you can take him from me?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. Jack's hand tightened around the grip of his bike's throttle, but he kept his cool. The situation was tense, but he wasn't going to let it escalate without a plan. "We're not here to fight," Jack said. "But if you don't let the kid go, we'll make you." The man laughed, a cold, empty sound that sent a shiver down Jack's spine. "You think you can intimidate me with your leather jackets and loud bikes? I've seen worse." Jack stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the man's, his voice steady but filled with purpose. "You don't know who you're messing with. This is bigger than you." The man's smile faded, and for the first time, Jack saw something flicker in his eyes, fear. It lasted only a moment, but Jack had caught it. Something wasn't right, and the man knew it. Before Jack could react, the man jerked his head toward the trees, and a series of figures stepped out from the shadows. Bikers. But they weren't on his side. Jack's heart sank as the situation rapidly spiraled out of control. They were surrounded. The man stepped back slightly, his eyes shifting nervously as the figures around him slowly revealed themselves. They were bikers, but not like the ones Jack had ridden with. These men were rougher, more menacing, their faces hidden beneath masks and helmets. They moved with a predatory grace, and Jack knew instantly that this wasn't just some random gang. These were organized, dangerous people. Jack's mind raced, quickly calculating the best way to handle the situation. He couldn't let this escalate into a full-on fight, not with the kids involved, but the odds were stacking up fast. The bikers around him were outnumbered, but they were still his crew, a family bound by loyalty, and they weren't about to back down. "What's going on here?" Jack's voice cut through the tension, loud and clear. The man with the boy grinned, a twisted smile spreading across his face. "This is my business now," he sneered. "And you've just walked into it. You should have stayed away." Jack stepped closer, ignoring the rush of adrenaline flooding his veins. He wasn't backing off. "You have the boy. You're not getting away with this." The man laughed again, his voice cold and unfeeling. "I'm not asking for your permission." As the man spoke, his gang of bikers took their positions, surrounding the clearing like wolves closing in on their prey. Jack felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The man had made his move, and now he was daring them to make theirs. The girl's brother, still standing there, looked dazed, but his eyes followed Jack as if he trusted him to get him out of this. Jack turned to his crew. "Get ready. We're going to have to make a move fast." The bikers tightened their grips on their bikes and the tools they brought, eyes scanning for any signs of movement. No one said a word. They didn't need to. They all knew what was at stake. Jack's heart pounded as he scanned the man, watching for any signs of weakness. He could see the tension in his eyes. The man wasn't as confident as he appeared. This wasn't just a random kidnapping. This was personal. Jack's eyes locked onto the man's. "You know this isn't over. We'll stop you," he said. The man's expression faltered for a moment, then hardened. He stepped back, as if sizing up the situation, weighing his options. "We'll see about that," he muttered, before signaling his men to move. That was all the invitation the bikers needed. In an instant, the tension snapped. The air was thick with the roar of engines as the bikers sprang into action. Jack led the charge, his bike growling as he twisted the throttle, aiming straight for the man. The gang around him quickly followed suit, riding with precision, cutting off the escape routes the man had planned. But the stranger wasn't going down without a fight. The gang members closest to Jack revved their engines, trying to block his path, but he was too quick. He swerved, dodging their attacks with ease. The man and his gang weren't giving up that easily, though. Jack could see them trying to regroup, pulling back into formation, and it was clear they had a plan. But Jack's focus never wavered. His eyes never left the boy. He knew what was at stake. The boy was their priority. As the bikers fought for control of the clearing, Jack's team worked together to block off every possible escape route for the man. Jack was closing in on him. "You made a big mistake, you know that?" Jack said, his voice low but filled with menace. The man turned to face him, his hand moving to his jacket. Jack immediately tensed, sensing that the man was about to pull a weapon. He had to act fast. Without hesitation, Jack lunged forward, using his bike's speed to his advantage, barreling straight into the man. There was a loud crash as the two collided, the force sending them both tumbling to the ground. Jack quickly regained his footing, drawing his own knife from his vest. He held it at the ready, keeping a wary eye on the man. "This ends now," Jack said, his voice hard. The man groaned, pushing himself up from the ground, but it was clear that he was losing ground. The bikers had him cornered, and there was no way out. "Give up. Let the kid go," Jack demanded. For a moment, the man hesitated. His eyes flickered with fear, but then he seemed to make a decision. With a swift movement, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a gun, aiming it straight at Jack. The tension in the air was palpable. Jack's mind raced, but before he could react, a shot rang out. But it wasn't from the man's gun. Instead, it came from one of Jack's crew. Bear, standing on the far side of the clearing, had fired his weapon into the air, creating a loud distraction. It was just enough for Jack to close the distance. He lunged forward, knocking the gun out of the man's hand, and in the next instant, he had him pinned to the ground. "You're done," Jack growled. The man struggled beneath him, but there was no escaping now. Jack stood up, breathing heavily, as his crew rushed to secure the area. The boy, still in the distance, finally started to move, cautiously walking toward the scene. Jack turned to him, a small, reassuring smile on his face. "You're safe now," he said. The boy's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't speak. He just nodded. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The fight was over. But as he looked around at his crew, the danger was far from finished. The man lay on the ground, his body still, his hands cuffed tightly behind him as Jack stood over him, breathing heavily, still processing the adrenaline. The bikers, once scattered across the clearing, now gathered around, their eyes scanning the area for any further threats. The boy, who had been standing in the distance, slowly approached, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and relief. His sister, still in the arms of Bear, looked just as relieved, her small body finally at peace after the chaos. Jack glanced over at the girl, and then at the boy, both of them finally free from the threat that had loomed over them for so long. It was done, but it didn't feel like a victory, not yet. Jack's mind raced. He kept looking over the man lying on the ground, his thoughts torn between anger and something else. The man, the kidnapper, the one who had held the boy hostage, was no longer a threat. But the situation was far from resolved. Jack had learned enough to know that when things seemed too quiet, that was when you had to watch your back. What happens now? Bear asked from behind him, his voice deep and calm. Jack didn't answer immediately. He looked at the two kids, then at his crew. We need to get out of here now, he said. We'll take the kids to a safe place and figure out what the hell this was all about. The bikers nodded, and without another word, they began to move. As they made their way down the hill, Jack couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't over. His instincts were always sharp, honed by years of experience. But even now, as the wind kicked up and the air seemed to calm, something inside him told him to be ready for more. They reached the bikes, and the children were helped onto the back of the safest bike they could find. Jack pulled his helmet on, his eyes never leaving the man on the ground. He had been silent for too long, but something about the way the man had reacted during the confrontation stuck with him. It was almost like he was waiting for something bigger than what had happened. As the bikers revved their engines and prepared to leave, Jack stayed back for a moment. His eyes locked onto the man's face, but the kidnapper wasn't looking back. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. It almost seemed too calm, too quiet. Jack wasn't fooled. The biker group rode off in formation, the children safely nestled behind them. The cool evening air whipped past them as they tore through the winding roads. Jack stayed close to the kids, the sound of his bike cutting through the air, his thoughts focused entirely on what had just happened. As they approached the outskirts of town, Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was a text from one of the bikers, Phantom, who had stayed behind to keep an eye on things. The message was short but troubling. He's not alone. More on the way. Jack's stomach sank. His mind instantly raced back to the man on the ground. Had this been a setup all along? Were there more people out there, waiting for the right moment to strike? It was clear that the man had been part of something much bigger. Jack wasn't going to take any chances. We need to keep moving, Jack said, his voice sharp. He pressed his bike harder, leaning into the throttle. Behind him, Bear followed suit, and the rest of the crew accelerated to keep up. They needed to get the kids somewhere safe and fast. Get to the warehouse on the west side. Jack barked into his communicator. We'll regroup there. The bikers pushed forward, their wheels eating up the miles. The town was growing distant in the rearview mirror, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The nagging sensation in his gut returned, stronger now. They were being hunted. The ride was long, but the longer they went, the more the tension in Jack's chest grew. When they finally arrived at the warehouse, they dismounted quickly, setting up a perimeter and making sure the kids were safe inside. Jack pulled off his helmet, his eyes scanning the horizon. It was too quiet. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew they were being targeted. Just as they began to settle in, a loud crash came from the back of the warehouse. The doors were being forced open. Get the kids to cover, Jack shouted. He didn't need to say more. The bikers rushed into action, positioning themselves around the kids. But before they could react, they heard the unmistakable sound of motorcycles revving in the distance. Jack's heart dropped. More of them were here. It's time to make a stand, Jack said, his voice steady despite the chaos brewing around him. The bikers prepared for the fight ahead. Jack had no idea how this was going to play out, but one thing was certain. They weren't going to let anyone take these kids away. The warehouse doors burst open, and a group of bikers entered, their figures silhouetted against the dim light. Jack stepped forward, his fists clenched, ready for whatever came next. It was time to end this, one way or another. The loud rumble of approaching motorcycles filled the air as Jack and the rest of the bikers braced themselves. The sound grew louder, and in the dim light, Jack could see the outlines of several figures riding toward the warehouse. His heart raced, his instincts screaming that this wasn't just another random gang looking for a fight. These riders were organized, methodical, and they were coming for something. Or someone. Stay sharp, Jack barked to his crew, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the situation. His eyes never left the oncoming group of bikers. They were coming in fast, their engines roaring like a storm on the horizon. Jack quickly positioned himself between the kids and the door, his hand resting on the grip of his bike, ready to spring into action. Bear, Diesel, and the others formed a perimeter around the kids, their bikes positioned defensively. The moment the other bikers reached the warehouse, the tension was unbearable. The new riders skidded to a halt just outside the warehouse, dismounting with military precision. They were led by a tall, menacing figure whose face was obscured by a dark helmet, but there was no mistaking the aura of authority that radiated from him. Jack stepped forward, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "What do you want?" he called out, his voice commanding yet calm, refusing to show any fear. The tall figure didn't respond at first. Instead, he slowly removed his helmet, revealing a scarred face with cold, calculating eyes. "I think you know exactly what we want," the man said, his voice low and threatening. "You've taken something that doesn't belong to you." Jack's mind raced. It wasn't just the boy anymore. It was something bigger. "We're not giving them back," Jack said firmly, his tone unwavering. "You're outnumbered. This ends here." The man smirked, clearly unimpressed by Jack's words. "We'll see about that." He gestured, and a few of his men moved to flank the bikers. The situation was escalating fast. Jack glanced at Bear, who met his gaze with a nod. Jack didn't want to escalate this further, but it was clear that these people were prepared for violence. "I don't want to fight," Jack said, trying to keep his voice even. "But I'll do whatever it takes to keep these kids safe." The scarred man's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "You don't understand," he said, his eyes narrowing. "We've been looking for that boy for a long time, and now we want him back. You can't protect him forever." Jack's stomach tightened. There was something deeper here, something more sinister than just a random abduction. "Who the hell are you?" Jack demanded, his patience wearing thin. "What do you want with the kids?" The man took a step forward, his hand resting on the handle of his bike. "We're not your enemies, but you're standing in our way. The boy's family owes us, and we always collect. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a gang trying to grab a kid for ransom. This was personal, and it was far more dangerous than anything he'd faced before. "I'm done talking," Jack said, his voice hardening. "Get out of the way, or we'll make you." The man's eyes flashed with anger. Without warning, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a weapon. Jack's reflexes kicked in, his hand grabbing for his own weapon, but before either of them could make a move, the sound of another motorcycle engine roared to life. The biker leading the gang turned his head, momentarily distracted by the sound. Jack didn't waste the opportunity. He moved quickly, closing the distance between himself and the scarred man. But before Jack could react, a shot rang out, the sound echoing through the warehouse. It wasn't aimed at Jack. He realized just in time that the shot had come from behind him. A member of Jack's crew, Phantom, had positioned himself on the other side of the warehouse. The shot had been a warning, a clear signal to the gang that this wasn't going to be an easy fight. The scarred man cursed under his breath, realizing that they had underestimated Jack and his crew. "You think you can stop us with a few bikes and guns?" the man sneered. "You're dead wrong." Jack held his ground, his body tense and ready for whatever came next. "You're outnumbered. You're not getting what you want," Jack said, his voice steady. "Not today." The man stared at him for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Then, with a sharp motion, he nodded to his men. "Fall back," he ordered. "We'll handle this another time." The group of bikers hesitated for a moment, exchanging glances, but the tension in the air was thick. Slowly, they began to back away, retreating toward their bikes. The scarred man turned to leave, but Jack wasn't about to let them go that easily. "Don't think this is over," Jack called out, his voice filled with finality. The man didn't look back, but his words reached Jack's ears. "It's not. This isn't over by a long shot." As the last of the gang members mounted their bikes and disappeared into the night, Jack felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of dread. This wasn't the end. They had just made a powerful enemy, and the fight was far from over. The kids, still shaken but safe for now, looked at Jack with a mixture of gratitude and fear. Jack walked toward them, his expression hardening as he made a silent vow to protect them, no matter what it took. The dust from the retreating gang's motorcycles still hung in the air as Jack stood in the clearing, the weight of the moment settling in. His crew had successfully repelled the attackers, but the threat had not gone away. Jack's mind was already racing, strategizing the next steps. The kids, still shaken but safe, huddled together in the corner of the warehouse, looking at Jack with a mixture of gratitude and fear. Jack turned to them, his voice soft but firm. "You're safe now. Stay close, and we'll get you out of here soon." The boy nodded, his eyes still wide, but his sister seemed to have a harder time letting go of the fear that had gripped her since they were first chased into the woods. Jack's gaze lingered on her for a moment before he looked back at his crew, who had begun to gather near the bikes. He felt the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. The bikers had been through battles before, but this felt different. They weren't just protecting their own. They were now the guardians of these children. The group's trust in him was palpable, but he knew they were all questioning what came next. "We need to move," Jack said, his voice carrying across the group. "The danger isn't over. We can't stay here too long." Bear, Diesel, and the others nodded in agreement, preparing their bikes for the next phase. The air was still thick with tension, but the riders knew what had to be done. Jack turned to Phantom, the sharp-eyed member of the crew. "I need you to keep an eye on the perimeter. Any movement, we need to know about it." Phantom gave a curt nod and moved to the far side of the warehouse, his bike engine cutting through the stillness as he disappeared into the distance. Jack turned to the kids, who were now sitting on the edge of a dusty table, their faces pale from fear. "Listen," Jack said, his tone gentle but serious. "I know you're scared, but you're safe with us. We're going to make sure nothing happens to you." The boy looked up at him, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is it over?" Jack hesitated for a moment, the weight of the question hanging in the air. "Not yet," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But we're ready for whatever comes next." As Jack spoke, a soft rumble broke the silence, the unmistakable sound of motorcycles echoing in the distance. His heart skipped a beat. They couldn't be back already, could they? "Stay here," Jack ordered, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Don't move. I'll handle this." His crew, seeing the change in his posture, immediately sprang into action. Bear and Diesel mounted their bikes, ready to ride out at a moment's notice. Jack moved quickly, walking toward the entrance of the warehouse, his senses on high alert. As the sound of the bikes grew louder, he stepped out into the open, his eyes narrowing as he searched for any sign of movement. He knew something wasn't right. The gang that had just retreated wasn't done. They had regrouped, and now they were coming for them. But Jack wouldn't let them have another chance. He wasn't going to let them hurt the kids again. The rumble of engines grew louder, and within moments, the shadows of the bikers appeared on the horizon, their silhouettes cutting through the fading light. This time, they weren't just coming in small groups. There were dozens of them, riding together in a massive convoy, their motorcycles lined up like an unstoppable force. Jack's stomach tightened as he realized they were being overwhelmed. He turned back to his crew, his voice cold and commanding. "Get the kids inside. Move now." Without hesitation, Bear and Diesel revved their engines and sped toward the warehouse doors, blocking them off to keep the kids safe inside. Jack and the others stayed outside, forming a tight perimeter, ready to face whatever was coming their way. As the first wave of bikers approached, Jack stepped forward, his fists clenched, his heart pounding with determination. "You want to fight? You've got one," he shouted, his voice ringing through the air. The gang slowed as they neared. Their leader, an imposing figure in a black leather jacket, pulled his bike to a halt. He removed his helmet, revealing a cruel smile that sent a chill down Jack's spine. "You really think you can protect them?" the leader sneered. "You're just delaying the inevitable." Jack stood tall, his eyes locked on the leader's, unflinching. "You can keep threatening us, but you're not taking these kids. Not while we're still breathing." The leader let out a low laugh, the sound echoing through the clearing. "You're a fool if you think this is over," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "This is just the beginning." Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. His crew was ready, and they weren't backing down. The bikers began to dismount, and Jack knew they were preparing for the next battle. The air was thick with anticipation, and Jack could feel the tension building. He wasn't about to let these men take the kids, not without a fight. As the gang members formed a circle around them, Jack motioned for his crew to stay sharp. This wasn't going to be easy, but Jack wasn't about to give up. Not when the stakes were this high. The fight was coming, and he was ready. He had promised these kids they would be safe, and he wasn't about to break that promise. "Let's finish this," Jack muttered under his breath, his eyes locked on the enemy. The bikers moved in, ready to defend their own. The showdown was about to begin. The group of bikers stood their ground as the enemy gang approached, their motorcycles revving, engines growling like an impending storm. The clearing in front of the warehouse became tense with the low hum of anticipation. Jack could feel the eyes of his crew on him, waiting for him to make the call. The air was thick with the threat of violence, but Jack's resolve was unwavering. The kids, now inside the warehouse and out of sight, were safe, for now. Jack focused on the gang, his mind calculating every move, every step. He had no intention of letting these men take the kids, no matter what it took. The leader of the gang, the imposing figure in black leather, smirked as he dismounted his bike. "You've really done it now," he said, his voice oozing with arrogance. "You think you can stand up to us? We've got more men, more power. You're outmatched." Jack's eyes never left the leader. He wasn't about to show weakness. "We'll see about that," Jack replied, his voice calm but firm. "We're not backing down." The leader's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "Then you're going to regret this," he said, motioning to his gang. The bikers around Jack's crew began to move, their eyes cold and calculated. They were ready for a fight, and Jack knew it was coming. The tension in the air was palpable, each second stretching into eternity. Suddenly, the leader's gang lunged forward, charging at the group with a violent roar. Jack's instincts kicked in. He moved quickly, positioning himself between the kids' hiding spot and the oncoming threat. His crew followed suit, jumping into action with synchronized precision. The first blow came from the enemy leader, who swung a chain at Jack, but Jack was faster. He ducked and sidestepped, grabbing the chain mid-swing and pulling it from the leader's hands. "You'll have to do better than that," Jack taunted, spinning the chain in his hand. The gang leader, furious, charged again, but Jack was already on the move. He swung the chain with expert precision, knocking the man off his feet. The fight quickly escalated. The bikers clashed, engines roaring and fists flying. It was chaos, the sound of leather against metal, the crack of fists meeting flesh, and the shrieks of engines filled the air. Jack's crew fought fiercely, their loyalty to each other and the kids fueling their every move. Bear, Diesel, and the others held their ground, taking on multiple opponents at once. Jack glanced over at the kids inside the warehouse, making sure they were still safe. The last thing they needed was for the enemy to break through and get to them. The enemy gang wasn't giving up, though. They had numbers, and they weren't afraid to use them. But Jack wasn't afraid either. He fought with a fire in his eyes, every move calculated, every punch thrown with purpose. One of the gang members lunged at him with a knife, but Jack saw it coming. He dodged to the side, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it, disarming him in one fluid motion. The fight seemed to go on forever. But Jack could feel the tide beginning to turn. His crew was pushing the enemy back, slowly but surely. The gang leader, realizing his group was being overwhelmed, tried to rally his men. "Fall back," he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "We need to regroup." But it was too late. The bikers had already pushed them to the edge, cornering them in the clearing. The leader's eyes flickered with panic, and Jack could see it. A crack in the man's confidence. Jack stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. "It's over. You're done." The leader hesitated for a moment, his gaze darting between Jack and the retreating members of his gang. He seemed to make a decision in that instant. Without warning, he bolted, running for his bike. "This isn't over," he yelled as he jumped on his bike and sped off into the night. His gang followed suit, retreating with him in a chaotic mess of bikes and dust. Jack stood there, panting, his fists still clenched. The fight was over, for now. His crew began to regroup, catching their breath. Jack turned to the warehouse, checking on the kids. They were safe, hidden inside, but the tension in the air was far from gone. Jack knew the gang would be back. He could feel it in his bones. "Everyone, get ready," he said, his voice low but filled with authority. "This fight isn't over. They'll be back with more, and we need to be ready." His crew nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. The kids may have been safe for now, but they were far from being out of danger. The road ahead was uncertain, and Jack knew it wasn't just a battle against the gang they had to worry about. It was the darkness that came with it, the shadow of the people they were up against. Jack stared into the distance, his mind already racing to plan their next move. The enemy was retreating now, But Jack knew they were only getting started. The warehouse was eerily quiet now. The engines of the retreating bikers had faded into the distance, but the tension still hung in the air like smoke from a fire that hadn't quite died out. Jack stood at the door of the warehouse, looking out over the clearing where the battle had just taken place. His crew was regrouping, their bikes lined up, and their faces hardened by the chaos. No one spoke immediately. They all knew this was just a temporary respite. The danger wasn't over. Jack's thoughts raced. They had won this round, but the gang would be back, and with more force. He could feel it in his gut. These men weren't going to back off that easily. He turned to Bear, who was checking his bike, making sure it was in good condition. "We need to move. We can't stay here much longer. We'll draw too much attention," Jack said, his voice low and purposeful. Bear nodded, his eyes scanning the area as if sensing the same threat. "I agree, but we need a plan. We can't just keep running." Jack exhaled sharply, wiping his face with the back of his hand. The sweat from the fight mixed with the dirt, but it didn't matter. He had a mission. "I know. We'll move the kids first. Get them out of here and find somewhere safe. Once they're secure, we can regroup and figure out our next move." As Jack turned to head inside to check on the kids, Diesel approached, his expression grim. "I don't like it, Jack. We barely got through this. The leader, the guy we took down, he was connected. I've seen that look before. Those men weren't just hired thugs. They've got connections. Someone bigger is behind this." Jack paused, glancing back at Diesel. "I know, but we don't have the luxury of waiting. If we stay here, we're sitting ducks." Diesel nodded slowly. "Just be careful, Jack. We've got to be smart about this." Inside the warehouse, the kids were huddled in a corner, quiet but visibly shaken. The boy, who had been so brave earlier, was now sitting with his sister, holding her close as if trying to protect her from the fear that still clung to them both. Jack approached them, crouching down to their level. "You both okay?" he asked softly. The boy nodded but didn't say anything. The girl, her eyes still wide with fear, looked up at Jack. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack gave her a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You're safe now. I'm going to make sure of it." The girl nodded, clinging to her brother as if her life depended on it. Jack felt a pang of guilt. He had promised them safety, but that promise was becoming harder to keep. The sound of a motorcycle engine roared in the distance, and Jack's head snapped toward the door. His instincts kicked in immediately, his body tensing as he listened. It was too soon for the gang to have come back, but the sound was unmistakable. Jack turned to his crew, who were already on alert. "Everyone, get ready. They're coming back. This time, we fight smart." The bikers rushed to position themselves around the warehouse, ready to defend the kids once again. Jack checked his gear, making sure his weapons were secure. He didn't know what kind of fight they were about to face, but he was ready. The sound of the motorcycle engines grew louder, now accompanied by the sound of several others. It wasn't just one group. The gang had returned, and they had brought reinforcements. Jack stepped to the front, his eyes narrowing as he saw the first of them appear on the horizon. This time, there were more riders, at least twice the number they had faced earlier. The leader from before was back, and he was clearly pissed off. His eyes locked onto Jack's as he rode forward, his hand raised to signal the rest of the gang to stop. "You really think you can protect them?" the leader shouted, his voice carrying across the distance. "You're outnumbered. You don't stand a chance." Jack stood tall, his voice steady but fierce. "I've heard enough of your threats. You're not taking these kids. Not while I'm standing." The gang leader smirked, clearly not taking Jack's threat seriously. "We'll see about that. You're a dead man walking." With a sharp motion, the gang surged forward, charging toward the warehouse. The sound of their engines shook the ground beneath them. Jack's crew immediately sprang into action, revving their bikes and rushing to block the oncoming attackers. The battle began once again, a chaotic blur of leather, metal, and roaring engines. Jack fought with everything he had, his movements fluid and precise, his every action calculated to keep the kids safe. The gang wasn't just trying to kill them, they were trying to send a message. Jack refused to let them win. The fight was brutal, but Jack could see his crew gaining ground. The gang members were being pushed back, their plans falling apart. As the bikers fought with the ferocity of a family protecting their own, Jack's focus never wavered. He moved toward the leader, who was still trying to rally his men. The leader glared at Jack, his fury palpable. "You think you've won?" he spat. You're just a small part of something much bigger. You can't stop us." Jack didn't respond. He simply lunged at the man, knocking him off his bike and into the dirt. The gang leader struggled, but Jack was faster, pinning him down with one swift move. "This ends now," Jack said, his voice cold. The gang leader struggled beneath him, but Jack's grip was unyielding. "You're not getting away," Jack said. As the leader's gang retreated once again, Jack stood over him, his chest heaving with exertion. The fight wasn't over yet, but they had won for now. The kids were safe, and that was all that mattered. Jack knew they couldn't let their guard down, but for the first time that night, he allowed himself a small breath of relief. The battle was far from finished, but for now, they had the upper hand. The smoke from the engines of the retreating gang was still hanging in the air as Jack and his crew stood in the clearing, their hearts racing from the fight that had just unfolded. The leader of the gang had been taken down, but Jack knew that this wasn't the end. His gut told him that the battle was far from over. He looked around at his crew, all of them still catching their breath after the intense confrontation. The kids were safe, but the moment they had been dreading had finally arrived. This war was personal, and it wasn't just about protecting the kids anymore. It was about survival. Jack walked over to Bear, who was checking his bike, making sure everything was still intact after the fight. "You good?" Jack asked, his voice steady despite the tension still thick in the air. Bear nodded, his face grim but resolute. "I'm good, but we need to get out of here. We can't keep running in circles. The longer we stay, the more danger we're in." Jack agreed. "I know, but we can't just leave the kids here. They need to be somewhere safe, and that's the priority right now." The sound of distant engines roared in the background again, causing Jack to freeze. The tension in the air grew heavy as he turned toward the sound. His instincts were screaming at him. "Stay alert," Jack warned, his voice low. "They're coming back, and they're bringing more people." Diesel, who had been scouting the perimeter, nodded in confirmation. "You're right. I've been hearing the engines for a while. They're not stopping. We need to make a move, now." The group quickly rallied, their focus sharp. They couldn't afford to sit around waiting for the next attack. The leader of the gang had made it clear, this wasn't over, and if they didn't act fast, they would be outnumbered. "Let's move the kids to the backup location," Jack ordered. "We'll figure out the next step when we get there. We're not staying in one place." The crew quickly gathered their things and prepared to leave the warehouse. Bear, Diesel, and the others mounted their bikes, revving the engines as they formed a protective circle around the kids. Jack watched as the children, still visibly shaken, were led to the backup van, their faces filled with both relief and fear. It was clear they didn't know what was coming next, but they trusted Jack. He couldn't let them down. As the convoy moved out, Jack kept his eyes on the road ahead, trying to push the dread in his gut to the back of his mind. The gang had a message for him, and he wasn't sure what it was yet, but Jack could feel the danger closing in. They had to get to the backup location, where they could regroup and figure out how to handle the next wave of threats. The convoy of bikers roared through the darkened streets, their headlights cutting through the night like beacons. The sounds of the engines echoed in the silence, a constant reminder of the perilous path they were on. Jack's grip tightened on the throttle, his focus unwavering. Every mile felt like an eternity, the weight of what was coming pressing down on him. "We're almost there," Bear said over the radio, his voice steady despite the situation. "Keep your heads down, everyone." The group continued riding, making their way to the backup location, a safe house hidden in a remote area. Jack's mind was working overtime, thinking through every possible scenario. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of a loud crash. A bike skidding out of control behind them. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he twisted the throttle and turned around. One of the bikers, a newer recruit named Raven, had lost control and was now sliding off the road. Jack slammed on the brakes, his crew following suit, and rushed to the fallen rider. Raven was still moving, groaning in pain, but it was clear he wasn't seriously injured. "You good?" Jack asked, kneeling beside him. Raven nodded weakly. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just got rattled." Jack helped him to his feet, his heart still pounding from the scare. "We don't have time for this," Jack said, his voice sharp. "Get back on the bike. We need to keep moving." Raven nodded, climbing back onto his bike with a grimace. The crew quickly regrouped, and they continued their ride, this time with even more urgency. The sound of the engines grew louder in the distance, and Jack could feel the presence of the gang closing in on them. They had no choice now but to press on. "We're not stopping until we're at the safe house," Jack said, determination in his voice. "We get there, and we regroup. That's the only way we're going to survive this." The convoy pressed on, their speed picking up as they neared the safe house. The streetlights flickered past, casting shadows on the road ahead, but the fear and uncertainty still weighed heavily on Jack's chest. They reached the location just as the gang's engines were heard growing closer. Jack's crew quickly dismounted, their movements swift and coordinated. They secured the perimeter of the safe house, making sure the kids were inside and safe. Jack stood at the entrance, watching as the others prepared for the inevitable showdown. They knew the gang was coming. They were ready. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by a message on his radio. "Jack," Bear's voice came through, urgent. "They're here. We need to move fast." Jack nodded, his jaw clenched. This was it. They had to make their stand. "Everyone, get into position," Jack said, his voice steady but commanding. "We fight here. We don't let them take this place." The final confrontation was at hand. Jack knew the battle ahead would be fierce, but he wasn't about to lose this fight. Not with the kids depending on them. Not when everything they had worked for was on the line. The sound of approaching motorcycles was unmistakable. It was deafening, and with every passing second, it grew louder, drawing closer to the safe house. Jack stood outside, his body rigid with anticipation. His crew had already taken their positions, securing the perimeter of the house, ensuring the children were safely tucked away inside. The tension was thick, but Jack wasn't about to back down. They had fought this hard to get here, and they were going to hold their ground. "They're coming," Bear's voice crackled through the radio. "They've got us surrounded." Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. He could feel the eyes of his crew on him, waiting for his command. They trusted him, and he wasn't about to let them down. "We hold this ground," Jack said firmly. "We fight until the end. If they want these kids, they'll have to go through us." The gang had regrouped and was now closing in on the safe house. They weren't just riding in one group anymore. There were several waves of bikers, all converging on the location. The gang leader's words echoed in Jack's mind. "This isn't over. You're just delaying the inevitable." Jack gritted his teeth. They weren't going to let this happen. The bikers continued to approach, and Jack's crew braced themselves. They weren't just going to sit back and let the gang tear apart what they had fought so hard to protect. The sound of the engines was growing louder. Jack's grip tightened on the handle of his bike, the cold steel a constant reminder of the battle that was about to unfold. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the first shots fired. The gang had arrived. "Here we go," Jack muttered under his breath. The first wave of bikers stormed toward the house, their bikes roaring as they reached the driveway. Jack moved quickly, signaling for his crew to take cover. They had to be tactical. Each biker knew their role. Bear and Diesel moved to the side, taking up positions on the flanks. The rest of the crew formed a defensive line at the front. Jack's heart was racing as the bikers surged forward. The first few riders attempted to break through the perimeter, but they were met with resistance. Jack could see the determination in his crew's eyes. They weren't giving up without a fight. "Push them back," Jack yelled as he revved his engine and charged forward. The clash of metal and leather was deafening as Jack slammed into the first biker, knocking him off his bike. But the gang wasn't backing down. They came at them harder, faster, as more bikers streamed into the clearing. The fight was on. Jack's crew fought with everything they had, pushing the gang back, inch by inch. The sounds of engines and shouting filled the air, a chaotic symphony of battle. Jack could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, each movement precise, every strike meant to protect the kids inside. As he fought, Jack's mind stayed focused on the mission. They had to hold their ground, but they couldn't afford to get overwhelmed. Every time he knocked one of the gang members down, another one seemed to take their place. It wasn't long before the gang leader appeared, his bike roaring through the chaos. "You think you've won, don't you?" the leader shouted, his voice filled with rage. "You've only delayed the inevitable." Jack stared him down, his jaw clenched. "We're not done yet," Jack said coldly. "And we won't stop until you're out of here." The gang leader lunged at him, swinging a chain. Jack ducked just in time, feeling the wind from the chain whip past his face. He retaliated quickly, using his own chain to disarm the leader. But the man wasn't done. He pulled a knife from his jacket and lunged again, this time aiming for Jack's side. Jack sidestepped, narrowly avoiding the blade, and grabbed the man's wrist, twisting it until the knife fell from his hand. With one swift motion, Jack knocked the gang leader to the ground. The gang leader grunted in pain, but Jack didn't let up. "This ends now," Jack said, his voice steady. But before he could react, a gunshot rang out. Jack froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The shot came from the side. A biker from the gang had gotten through the line and was trying to flank them. Jack's mind raced. He had to act fast. Without hesitation, he drew his own weapon, taking down the biker with a precise shot. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the clearing, and the gang leader scrambled to his feet, looking at his men. "Fall back," he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. But it was too late. Jack's crew had already gained the upper hand. The remaining bikers from the gang were now retreating, their formation collapsing under the pressure. Jack stood tall, watching as the last of the enemy bikers sped off into the night, their engines fading into the distance. The fight was over, for now. Jack's crew regrouped, their eyes scanning the area for any remaining threats. Jack turned to the kids, who were still inside the house, waiting anxiously. The fight had been fierce, but the kids were safe. For now, they were protected. Jack didn't let himself relax just yet. He knew this was only temporary. The gang would regroup, and they would come back. But Jack wasn't going to let them win. Not while he still had breath in his body. "We're not finished," Jack said to his crew, his voice filled with resolve. "But tonight, we've won." The bikers nodded, acknowledging the brief victory. They knew the war wasn't over. But for tonight, they had kept their promise. The kids were safe, and Jack wasn't about to let anyone take that away. The night was eerily quiet after the chaos had subsided. The distant rumble of retreating motorcycles had faded, leaving behind a haunting stillness that filled the air. Jack stood outside the safe house, staring into the distance, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. The gang had retreated for now, but Jack knew better than to think it was over. They had sent a message, but that message wasn't one of surrender. It was a warning. Jack's eyes darted over to his crew, who were checking their bikes, making sure they were in working condition. Everyone was on edge, and rightfully so. They had faced an onslaught, and though they had held their ground, Jack's gut told him that this was only the beginning. As he turned to head inside to check on the kids, Bear caught up with him. "What's the next move?" Bear asked, his voice steady, but there was a hint of unease in his eyes. Jack sighed, rubbing his face with one hand. "We keep moving. The kids are safe here for now, but we can't stay in one place for long. We need to get them somewhere more secure, somewhere out of reach of these assholes." Bear nodded, understanding. "We'll keep them safe, Jack. You know we got your back." Jack gave him a brief nod, appreciating the loyalty of his crew. It wasn't just about keeping the kids safe anymore. It was about survival. They had made enemies, powerful ones, and now, those enemies would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Jack entered the safe house, the familiar sound of the door creaking shut behind him. The kids were sitting in a corner, their eyes wide with fear, but filled with gratitude. Jack's heart softened as he looked at them. They were just kids, caught in something they couldn't understand. "You guys okay?" he asked, crouching down to their level. The boy nodded but didn't speak. His sister, however, looked up at Jack, her eyes filled with worry. "Are they coming back?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jack took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "They won't hurt you," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We're not going to let them." The girl's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but she nodded, clutching her brother's hand. Jack turned to leave, his mind already working through their next steps. The kids needed to be moved, but they couldn't just pick up and leave without a plan. As Jack stepped outside again, he was met by Diesel, who had been keeping watch. "They're gone for now," Diesel said, his voice low. "But we both know they won't be gone for long." Jack looked up, his gaze hardening. "I know. They're coming back. And when they do, we'll be ready." The night air was cold, but Jack felt the heat of determination burning within him. They couldn't let these people win. Not after everything they'd been through. Jack's crew had fought hard to get here, and they weren't going to back down now. The plan was simple. They needed to get the kids to a safer location, somewhere the gang wouldn't find them. But that wasn't going to be easy. The gang had connections, and they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by a noise in the distance. He turned, instinctively reaching for his weapon. But it was only the sound of his crew, moving into position. Jack exhaled, feeling the tension ease from his shoulders. "We're ready," Bear said, his voice carrying across the darkness. "Let's move." Jack nodded, signaling for the crew to fall in line. They had a plan, and they were going to execute it. The kids needed to be moved, and they needed to get to a place where they could regroup and figure out how to stop the gang from coming after them again. The bikers started their engines, the roar of the bikes filling the quiet night. The convoy moved in formation, the headlights cutting through the darkness as they made their way toward the next safe house. Jack rode at the front, his mind constantly scanning the road ahead. They couldn't afford to get complacent. Not now. The sound of their bikes echoed in the quiet night, a reminder that they were a force to be reckoned with. But the calm before the storm was unsettling. Jack knew they weren't just riding away from their enemies. They were heading straight into the unknown, where danger lurked around every corner. As they reached the outskirts of town, Jack's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, glancing at the screen. It was a message from Phantom. "They're still tracking us," the message read. "We're not clear yet." Jack's stomach tightened. He had known it was too quiet. They hadn't escaped the gang's radar. They were still being hunted. "They're not giving up," Jack muttered under his breath, his voice low and determined. "But neither are we." He put his phone away, focusing back on the road ahead. They couldn't let their guard down. The enemy was still out there, and they were closing in. The convoy rode on, but the sense of urgency was palpable. The gang would stop at nothing to get what they wanted, and Jack's crew was prepared to do whatever it took to keep the kids safe. As they neared the safe house, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He looked over at Bear, who was riding next to him. "Something's not right," Jack said, his voice tense. Bear glanced around, scanning the road ahead. "I know," Bear said quietly. "We'll stay sharp." The convoy approached the safe house, but Jack's gut told him that danger was closer than they realized. They had to be ready. The fight wasn't over yet. The sound of the engines grew louder as the convoy of bikers neared the safe house. Jack could feel the weight of every moment pressing down on him, his instincts screaming that danger was closing in fast. The kids were still with them, riding safely in the middle of the group, but Jack knew the situation was far from secure. The gang had regrouped, and they weren't done with them. He glanced over at Bear, who was riding next to him, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We're close," Jack said quietly, keeping his voice calm despite the tension building in his chest. Bear nodded, his eyes narrowing as he studied the road ahead. "We'll get there, but we need to stay sharp. This isn't over." Jack didn't respond. His focus was on the road ahead. The safe house was within reach, but his gut told him that something wasn't right. It was too quiet. They had been on high alert for so long that the silence felt unnatural. As they approached the edge of town, Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out quickly, his heart racing. The message on the screen was brief but ominous. "They're closing in. Move faster." It was from Phantom, who had been keeping an eye on their rear. Jack's stomach tightened. The gang was on their tail, and they were getting closer. "They know where we're going," Jack muttered, his voice tight with frustration. "We can't stay here." Bear glanced over at him, his expression grim. "No kidding. We need to make a move. Fast." Jack's mind raced. The safe house wasn't far, but they couldn't risk leading the gang directly to it. They needed to throw them off, confuse them, give themselves time to prepare. "We'll take the back roads," Jack said. "If they're following us, they'll expect us to take the main roads. We'll lose them in the twists and turns." Bear nodded in agreement. "Good idea, but we need to be quick." Jack signaled to the rest of the crew, who were riding behind him. They didn't need to be told twice. The convoy veered off the main road, turning onto the narrow back roads that led through the woods. The ground was uneven, and the path was treacherous, but it was the fastest way to lose their pursuers. The sound of the engines echoed through the trees, but Jack's attention was split between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, watching for any sign of the gang. As they sped through the winding roads, Jack could feel the tension in his body tightening. They had to make it to the safe house before the gang could catch up. But his mind was racing, wondering just how much time they had. The thought of the kids in the back of the convoy, still vulnerable, made Jack's stomach churn. They had to keep them safe. They couldn't afford to lose them now. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, the trees thick and dark, blocking out the light of the moon. Jack's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the path in front of them. He could hear the others following closely behind, but the silence that filled the night only added to the unease that gnawed at him. As they approached a sharp curve in the road, Jack suddenly slammed on the brakes. He heard a loud screech behind him as the other bikers followed his lead, barely avoiding crashing into him. The sound of motorcycles skidding echoed through the trees, but Jack's focus was on the curve ahead. His heart skipped a beat when he saw the headlights. The gang was here. They had found them. Jack's grip on the throttle tightened. "They're on us," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to outrun them." The gang's bikes appeared from around the bend, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Jack could see the figures of the bikers, their faces obscured by helmets, their intentions clear. They were coming for them, and they weren't going to stop. Jack revved his engine, leading the convoy as they sped up the winding road. The gang wasn't far behind, but Jack pushed forward, the adrenaline rushing through him as he focused on staying ahead. "Don't let them catch us," Jack shouted over the roar of the engines. The crew responded with fierce determination, pushing their bikes harder, navigating the sharp turns with precision. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced over at Bear. "Keep the kids safe. We can't afford to lose them." Bear nodded, signaling to the other bikers to stay close to the convoy. They couldn't risk getting separated. The gang was getting closer, their engines roaring louder with each passing second. Jack's eyes scanned the road ahead, looking for any advantage they could use to escape. As they rounded another sharp turn, Jack spotted a narrow path leading off the main road. It was risky, but it might be their only chance. "Follow me," Jack shouted, swerving his bike onto the path. The others followed, their bikes skidding as they navigated the uneven ground. The gang wasn't far behind, but Jack had gained a slight lead. The path ahead was narrow, winding through the thick trees. The sound of the gang's engines grew fainter, but Jack knew they wouldn't give up that easily. They would find another way to catch up. Jack pushed his bike harder, the trees blurring as he sped through the path, his mind focused on one thing: getting the kids to safety. "Almost there," Jack said through gritted teeth. "Just a little further." The safe house was within sight, but the gang was still in pursuit. Jack could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They had made it this far, but the final stretch was going to be the hardest. They had to make it. Jack's heart raced as they neared the safe house. He looked back at his crew, their faces determined, and then ahead at the house. They were almost there, but the gang was closing in fast, and Jack knew they had to make their final move before it was too late. The sound of engines grew louder as Jack's heart raced, the safe house now in sight. The gang had been chasing them for miles, but they were getting closer with every second. Jack could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The kids were still riding in the convoy, their safety his top priority, but he knew they couldn't outrun this threat for much longer. The final stretch was ahead of them, and Jack had one last move in mind. The path to the safe house was narrow and winding, but Jack had faith in his crew. He could hear the roar of the gang's bikes behind them, the sound growing louder with every turn. "Push it," Jack shouted, his voice cutting through the roar of the engines. "We're almost there." His crew responded with a renewed sense of urgency, pushing their bikes harder, navigating the sharp turns with precision. But the gang was relentless, gaining on them with every passing second. Jack's thoughts raced. They couldn't let this end in a standoff. They had to make it to the safe house before the gang surrounded them. As they neared the final bend in the road, Jack saw the safe house in the distance. It was within reach, but they weren't there yet. "Almost there," Jack muttered under his breath, his grip tight on the throttle. But then, without warning, a biker from the gang cut in front of them, blocking their path. Jack swerved, narrowly avoiding a collision, his heart racing. The gang was closing in, and they weren't going to stop. Jack's mind raced, calculating their options. He had to act fast. "Bear, take the kids inside." "Now," Jack shouted. Bear nodded, turning his bike toward the safe house, speeding ahead to get the kids inside. Jack's crew followed suit, keeping the gang at bay as they made their way to the door. Jack's eyes never left the gang. The leader, riding in the front, was determined to finish what they had started. Jack knew they had no time to waste. The gang was closing in fast, and if they didn't act now, they would be trapped. As they reached the entrance of the safe house, Jack slammed on the brakes, bringing his bike to a halt. He looked over at his crew, who had formed a protective barrier around the kids. The leader of the gang approached, his bike roaring as he pulled up to Jack. This is it, the leader sneered, his voice filled with venom. You can't protect them forever. You're out of time. Jack stood tall, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. You're not taking them, Jack said, his voice unwavering. Not while I'm standing. The leader sneered, his grip tightening on the handlebar of his bike. We'll see about that, he growled, his men revving their engines in response. Jack's crew stood firm, ready for the final showdown. The gang wasn't going to give up, and neither were they. Jack glanced over at Bear, who was securing the kids inside. He knew the crew was ready. They had been through hell and back, but they weren't backing down. Let's end this, Jack muttered under his breath. The leader signaled to his men, and the gang surged forward, charging at Jack's crew with a fury that could only come from desperation. The fight erupted in an instant, a clash of metal, leather, and raw power. Jack's crew fought with everything they had, pushing the gang back step by step. Jack was everywhere at once, moving with a purpose, blocking attacks, and striking back with precision. The gang wasn't going down easily, but neither was Jack. Every punch, every move, was fueled by the same determination: protect the kids at all costs. The gang leader lunged at Jack, a knife in his hand. Jack dodged the first strike, but the leader was fast. The knife came down again, but Jack was ready. He grabbed the leader's wrist, twisting it until the knife fell to the ground. With a swift motion, Jack knocked the leader off his feet, pinning him to the ground. This ends now, Jack said, his voice low and filled with resolve. The leader struggled beneath him, but Jack didn't let up. You're done, Jack growled, tightening his grip. The rest of the gang was retreating, realizing they had lost. Their leader was down, and their strength had crumbled. Jack's crew had won, but the fight had taken its toll. Jack stood over the leader, his chest heaving from the fight. Get out, Jack said coldly, looking down at the gang leader. And don't come back. The leader glared at him, his eyes burning with hatred. This isn't over, he spat, before signaling his remaining men to retreat. The gang, defeated for now, turned and sped off into the night, their engines fading into the distance. Jack watched them go, his body still tense, but his mind racing. This wasn't the end. The gang would be back. But for now, they had won. Jack turned toward the safe house, his heart still pounding. The kids were safe, for now, and that was all that mattered. He walked toward the door, knowing the battle wasn't over. They had fought hard, but the war was far from won. Jack's resolve hardened. He would protect them, no matter what it took.